So bless you, my darling, my angel. Heaven is mine, and life is divine with you.
I'm talking with Elaine Ayagata. We're talking about her story, I Was the Shy One. And Elaine, you and I were just talking about how much we love to listen to older people tell stories. I loved listening to my grandfather tell me wild and crazy stories. Um, so why don't you tell us about Ada and how she was kind of thrust amongst other adults and just how she realized they were a great source for learning.
I think that, when I was a kid, it dawned on me that if I added up the age of my mother and my father, there was so many years there of knowledge that they had that I didn't have yet. So anytime they were talking, it was important, and that's how I learned things, just by hearing them, by being around them. And even the previous generation, I couldn't be around my grandparents enough. I mean, they were just like Wikipedia, walking Wikipedias. It's not often that you can, talk to, I remember there were elderly neighbors, these women I would just check in on, all these elderly women. I'd bring them flowers, and just sit and listen to them for hours. This neighbor behind me, I just rang her doorbell and I'm like, how are you doing today? And I'm in like third grade, and she's like 89. She's like, come in, let's talk, and, you know, oh yeah, we went down to see the Hindenburg, and we were there when the Wright brothers were, and it just always fascinated me. So Ada was like that. And she had a very high IQ. Even though she might have been 6, she was like 12. She was very smart. And people really didn't see that right away because of her debilitating shyness. So, here she is as a child, not with a particularly great father, a kind of quiet mother, a regular, family. And then she is in this, death wing, slated to die, and miraculously survives. And her family isn't even in the country anymore. And she forges this amazing relationship with the doctor, and is then on a huge ship. The Carpathia was a huge ship, full of adults. There weren't too many kids. She didn't know how to play shuffleboard, so here she is around adults. And again, fascinated by everything they're talking about. She actually was quite attached to Captain Rostron. Before the tragedy, he really loved spending time with the kids at the dining hall or whatever. I mean, he really went out of his way. And, she's sharing her Oreos and, Whitman sampler with him. And he was just absolutely amazed, that, again, that, these sharing these two brand new snacks was a great way for her to bridge her shyness. But she loved being in the company of adults because that was a great source of learning for her. And the ship was full of all these adults. The backside of that was after the tragedy, when the survivors came on. Some of them just sat, in a deck chair with a couple of blankets and barely ate, if they ate, drank coffee and had a blank stare. These people had just lost maybe everybody in their family. And there was a whole poll that landed on the ship with the survivors. It wasn't a merry ship. It wasn't a lot of chatty, happy conversation. It was just tragedy, comparing tragedies. And so it was a very adult environment. In the beginning, it was a great environment because she was able to learn so much. There was an artist, a famous artist on the Carpathia. There was, a couple of authors. There was, a couple of doctors. There was always people that were fascinating to meet. And she loved learning from all these adults. Here she is, just a young kid, very mentally advanced, very precocious, but totally amongst adults. And then this obliterating event happens. It's funny because she was not allowed to drink coffee, obviously, as a child, but she had a little. I think it was half coffee and half cocoa, so it was like a mocha. And she gets wired off the coffee and is able to stay up all night. and and they're racing. He understands what's happening with Captain Rostron, and she understands what the tragedy is, because the nurses had been reading the newspapers to her about the Titanic. Again, more adults around her. She can't read, but she's looking at the pictures of the newspapers, and she's learning what's happening in Southampton. The Titanic is leaving the same day the Carpathia is leaving, and it's amazing how these two competitors that hate each other, how their destinies collide. Pardon the pun. And it's just an astonishing thing. I remember her saying, and this isn't the language of that a kid wouldn't know, but again, she's around so many adults and the conversations, and she absorbs it. But she's like, when we get to the longitude and the latitude of where the Titanic should have been, and it's not there, it's 6 miles under us. She said, Elaine, in that moment, you just don't even understand what that felt like. And there's shrapnel in the water. There's just floating produce and scraps of deck chairs and wood, and just it's amazing. And she's old enough and astute enough to hear what's going on and know what's going on and wired on caffeine. So I mean, it's amazing these things all come together. In the first lifeboat that they came across, there was a priest, that yelled, "I see a light." And so here's this child, okay, that's again very precocious and surrounded by adults. The really cool thing is, if her parents had been on that ship, they would have forbid her to be anywhere near this, locked the door, and they would have all stayed in the bedroom. But because she was an unaccompanied minor, with a chaperone, she was allowed to be completely saturated in the middle of this completely adult event. There were no kids around. I mean, so it was really, really amazing that she was right there. And when she would tell me about that, which I just would be like trying to put myself in that position, like, wow. Like, I loved being around adults and elderly people when I was little. I loved it because every time they talked, they talked about, the world in, 1920 and 19, and it was nothing I would ever know firsthand. They talked about their grandfather in the 1800s in Italy. They talked about, and I'm like, it was a link to a different time that I wasn't allowed to live in. So I always learned the minute they were talking amongst themselves what Italy was like in the 1800s, what Scotland was like from, Ada's side of the family. They came from Scotland. So, I mean, it was like, I loved it because this was a bridge into another time. And, some kids miss that. They run off and they're out playing, and they miss the fact that these people aren't going to be around forever. And when they die, they take these stories with them. And I knew that. So that was part of my hysteria, to get as many of these stories out of my aunt that I could. I mean, she probably told me the story upwards to 40 times before she passed away. And it was never enough. It was just always something that always fascinated me, particularly when another piece would slip out that she didn't realize she didn't tell me before. And I was always just so hungry for any little scrap that was there. And that's just, I know people that are like that. And I think that you get to be more intelligent quicker by understanding that the older generation is of great value for a lot of reasons. I knew my great grandparents, many of them, and they were just, I couldn't, other than Ada's father, who didn't talk about anything. He was the exception. The other ones were amazing to be around. And I was the same as Ada when she was little. I couldn't be around them enough. They were such a source of astonishment. They did these most amazing things. I mean, here's Ada. So after the Titanic, it lands in New York, and here's all the other things that happened to her that, allowed her to really, disallowed her to talk about this event in her life, like the Spanish, flu came through, the influenza, and killed so many people. That was just a complete plague, like COVID was. The stock market crashing, the waiting in the food lines. I mean, all these world events, the war broke out. All these world events happened almost right after the Titanic sank in 1912. So there wasn't time for Ada to keep talking about, her big story, because the world moved on rapidly into the next tragedy and the next event. So, in talking to somebody like Ada, yes, the Titanic was a piece of it, but she also had all these other pieces that were just, these weren't things I was ever going to be able to live in my lifetime. And they weren't things I was ever going to have a connection or an understanding to. Yet by talking to them and hearing it, holding on to it and absorbing it was a great way for me to learn about her whole, with the Carpathia, the whole thing, her whole story. Um, I really wish she wrote it down and there was a diary we could have found, but I mean, being told the story 40-ish times, there was enough to remember. And Google was a phenomenal source to research it. And putting all the pieces together was a cool job. And that's why I think this is so powerful, because it gives us a complete glimpse into that night. Only it's never talked about. The vantage point from the other boat is never even talked about. It's always the Titanic is so prominent, so prominent. But there's another whole side of the coin, and this is the whole side of it. So it's really it's an amazing thing. It's tragedy. It's got something for everybody. It's a Greek tragedy. It's got I mean, whole families were gone. At the end of the manuscript, I put pages and pages and pages of 1962 1962 or 1462 people that lost their lives. And if you look, there's entire families, great grandparents, grandparents, parents, children, babies. There's whole groups that were just gone, whole groups that, infants, okay, some a couple of months old, and, it's just, and I think like 3 different priests, just, it's just, and that's the memorial that I wanted to have at the back of the manuscript. These lives that didn't get fulfilled, these people that never got to explain their story to people that cared to listen, like me listening to Ada, like Ada listening to all the adults that she was around on the Carpathia. Again, but the beginning of the ship ride was exciting and fun, and then the tragedy, and then again, how the adults changed through the process in correlation to how her shyness goes away. They're amazing stories that parallel each other, while this whole story unfolds. It's pretty cool to see. And she still got her indomitable spirit in the middle of the post rescue and the PTSD that everyone is so, and just shock. There are people that just don't even seem to blink, she told me. There are women that just didn't even, she's saying, I didn't even know if they get up to go to the bathroom, Elaine, because they just never seemed to leave that chair. They were just in that blank stare. They just were literally a catastrophe. They may have survived, but everything they ever knew was gone that they ever loved. So, that whole part of it too. But I think the victory lap and the whole thing, I absolutely want to include this. The victory lap and the whole thing for Ada, and the proof and the trophy, is when she's coming down the ramp at the end. She actually has what I would say is a panic attack. She has what's called, I would say, is a panic attack. She's leaving the chaperone, and she's leaving everything that just happened to her. And in those days, the dresses are made from miles of fabric. I mean, those dresses are just heavy, and there's, underwire and, corsets, and, they're so elaborate and so astonishing. The Downton Abbey dress, and so here she is, and she just collapses, with her doll and her satchel. Her legs get weak and she collapses, and she just doubts herself. She doubts herself. And the old Ada isn't quite dead yet, because it resurrects itself. The shy, crippling, debilitating whispers to her, and she goes down with a panic attack on the ramp when she's, coming off the boat in New York. And these miles of dress fabric are hitting her, because these women are just going by her. No one stopped to help. They were just, the dress fabric was just hitting her in the head. And then when she summons all of everything that could give her strength to do this on her own, to physically stand up, she's like Bambi with her legs out, so she physically, I can do this, because she remembers what she just went through, the different sentences from the different adults, the different input, the different things the doctor ever said to her, the different things Molly and she just, and this becomes this swirling, amazing in her mind, and she summons the muscles in her legs to stand again with great difficulty. And here's this child, okay? And she stands again, regains herself, asserts herself, and continues the walk down the ramp to all the waiting police at the bottom, yelling that she's an unaccompanied minor, yelling her name and yelling that she's an unaccompanied minor. And then just, landing in a wonderful police officer's arms. And he grabs her, and it's just beautiful because she summons what's left of her shyness. It dies on the ramp right there. And what resurrects in its place is this new bravery, this I can do this. Look at everything that everyone just overcame on this boat, including me, and I can do this. And that's really a beautiful scene. And it's funny because when the doctor is there to pick her up again, because he was visiting a couple of cousins in New York, and he really didn't even go back, to Boston yet. So he's just there to get her. She is a different human being. She's a different human being. She's overcome the shyness, not because she wanted to, but just that's a result of the net of what just happened. And it's absolutely amazing. And so who he puts up on his shoulders is nothing near the completely crippled child that was hysterical when they were leaving, when she got on the boat. Those two scenes are so powerful, and they're so different from each other. They're polar opposites. That's the victory lap over there, when she is an overcomer in a sea of people that are completely mourning. She actually is an overcomer and comes off the boat in victory. And this girl on the doctor's shoulders now, Dane just can't even believe the human being she is. She's nothing like what he dropped off. It's a really beautiful metamorphosis that she just, it's really astonishing. And to see it in writing and read it, but at some point to see it on a screen, it is an emotional thing. It's just a beautiful thing to see somebody overcome and be victorious.
It's an incredible story, and fantastic link to the past. And I'm so glad that you wrote the story down, because when a person's gone, the story goes with them. But
Mm.
thankfully, you have this incredible story. Thank you, Elaine.
Thank you so much.